Welcome, friends, to Breakfast in the Ruins, a Michael Moorcock-flavoured podcast. On this show, we're looking at a book that was acknowledged by Mike as a major influence on his early works, and that has been one of the most influential pieces of fantasy fiction on the genre as a whole, particularly a cornerstone of the fantasy gaming milieu. It also appears in Moorcock and Cawthorne's Fantasy, the 100 Best Books. This top 100 doesn't rank those 100, but it's on page 149 if you're interested. I'm joined by a new guest co-host for this one, acclaimed author and creator of the Shadows of the Apt and Children of Time series, amongst many other things, Adrian Tchaikovsky. When we had a quick exchange about what we could cover, Adrian suggested Jack Vance's The Dying Earth. And it was a great choice because somehow, despite knowing of it for decades, having the Fantasy Masterworks omnibus on the shelf for years, and understanding to a degree its influence on certain things, I'd never read it. Or, for that matter, any Jack Vance, that I can remember, at least. Although I did write a lot of sci-fi, and I know for a fact that I had a few of them care of pops back in the day, and might still have a couple, so it's possible I did read the odd one, but most of them, if not all of them, went in the Great Purge when I upped sticks and moved in with Phil all those many moons ago. I've also had a Lioness omnibus on the shelf for a few years, and the RPG, and, as I found when I was rooting around a few days ago, the Guy and Reach RPG based upon one of his sci-fi settings, but still haven't got round to cracking those open either. I don't even remember getting the Guy and Reach, or the companion gazetteer, but that's not unusual to be honest. I need a clear out, really. But anyway, Jack Vance does have a presence in my house, despite my lack of attention. But who was he? Well, as we rolled snake eyes last time I pulled the unfeasibly heavy encyclopedias of fantasy and science fiction off the shelf, I will do so again to see if maybe we'll find something useful in what Messrs. Clute, Davy and Nichols have to say on the subject. Well, I might have been dreaming a couple of those names. The Encyclopedia of Fantasy is John Clute and of course John Grant. So let's see what this has to say about Jack Vance. Vance, Jack, working name of the US writer John Holbrook Vance, whose contributions to SF are extensive, and who early in his career established the Dying Earth subgenre of far future fantasy with the Dying Earth collection of linked stories in 1950. The remote setting owes something to Clark Ashton Smith's Zothique stories. Jack Vance's achievement was stylistic, with an ironic narrative tone appropriate to an exhausted world of melancholy and dying falls haunted by strange monsters where the dimmed sun wobbled precariously through a dark blue sky and might at any moment go out. The generally amoral character's barbed formality of diction, distinctly reminiscent of Ernest Brahm, is expertly turned to dramatic or comic effect. In a famous passage, an augur states his fees. For the 20 terces I phrase the answer in clear and actionable language. For 10, I use the language of cant, which occasionally admits of ambiguity. For 5, I speak a parable, which you must interpret as you will. And for 1 terce, I babble in an unknown tongue. His influence on fantasy has been immense, enduring and gratefully acknowledged by, for example, Gene Wolfe, whose The Book of the New Sun is the most significant rearticulation to date of the Dying Earth theme. Jack Vance received the World Fantasy Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1984. I don't think we'll also pull off the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, because it's too heavy. Instead, I shall just invite you to pull up a weird chair, probably more designed for aesthetic value than comfort. Bar the door against strange visitors with the 12 implacable seals of Bathnoog, and prepare Jeff some welcome rebuke in case they're persistent in their unwelcome vocabulary. And join Adrian and me on a journey to the Dying Earth. Well, we're back in Derry and Toms, and this time I'm joined by an all-new co-host in the form of Adrian Tchaikovsky, author. You're a gamer, you're a dabbler in miniatures, and I'm sure various other things. I saw, I think on Blue Sky, I think you were painting some minis not so long ago.
Yes, yeah, it's. I took it up as a hobby around lockdown, and it's become like a major de-stressor. So I do that and I sketch because they're both they're non-writing activities, but you still have something at the end that you've done, so it sort of ticks a box.
Yeah. Um, yeah, those lockdown habits have become big deals for a lot of us, I think. Gaming was a lifeline for me during lockdown, certainly at the point where I probably mentioned this before, but I was invited to game online and I'd never done it before. Miniatures, I never got into as a gamer. As a young man, I was always more of sounds really pretentious, doesn't it? Theatre of the mind, man. Theatre of the mind. So I never really got into figures, although I do still have a Garfield alarm clock box from when I was 13 that I got for Christmas, which is still full of lead miniatures. And it's in here somewhere, God knows where. I really should dig them out. I think I had half-assed attempts to paint them a couple of times, but never really got that far with it. I'm far too cack-handed. But I can imagine if you've got a steady hand, it's probably a really relaxing hobby.
Yeah, I mean, it was a thing that I remember trying to do when I was a teenager and just utterly lacking the patience for. And now I'm a bit older, I can actually just sit there and do it for its own sake, and it's really fun.
Yeah,
I mean, my tabletop gaming had the same kind of transformation during lockdown because I've had this very long running group that we've been meeting like twice a year because we're now scattered all over the country. And then during lockdown, we thought, right, let's give this whole online gaming a try. And now we play every week. So,
oh, lovely. Is that purely online?
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't done much online gaming for a while. The one that Clarkey invited me to join in 2020 kind of petered out a little bit, and I keep meaning to get them. I've said, why don't I run a game for you and I'll go in again. And they'll go, oh yeah, that sounds really, really good. And then I just never get around to it because there's not enough hours in the day. I'm also a really, really lazy GM, and I can't pace things at all. So the idea of doing 2.5 hours per week and trying to make it meaningful and have incident, I find almost impossible. Because generally when we do play face-to-face, we get drunk and play for 6 hours and everything rambles to a halt and nobody can remember it the next time round.
I'm experimenting at the moment. I am trying to do literally a pick-up zero prep game for members of the kind of the online writing group I'm part of.
Oh.
And so it's literally whoever turns up, you get a character. We'll do a scenario. I'm doing the game I'm using is called Swivers, which is kind of a very low
Love
mechanics.
It, yeah. I backed the Kickstarter. I really like it.
Yeah, no, it's a phenomenal game and a very, very well-written book. But even though it lends itself to that kind of play, and we've done quite well, I found that I'm kind of incapable of doing zero prep. Because as soon as you've done one scenario, you start, right, well, I will build on that, and I will kind of, that will have these ramifications, and you just start adding things and adding things and adding things, and then when you turn up for the next session, you're there with like a map and 5 pages of notes. So.
Yeah. I think there's something really intriguing and attractive about the idea of people who don't game who will listen to this. Just stick with us. We're going to talk about books soon. We're going to talk about the dinosaur, but we've got to talk about this. The idea of a zero prep game is so tempting and so exciting, particularly for someone like me who's a lazy GM. But actually, there is something about coming up with some notes, coming up with some ideas, coming up with some settings that's, it's satisfying, isn't it? Yeah. I don't want to do everything by random table, Right. You are Adrian Tchaikovsky. You are a prolific author. Just read Shroud, by the way.
Very kind.
Most enjoyable. But you've been writing in the sci-fi and fantasy genre for how long now?
About a little over 15 years. It's 2007 was the first book out. I mean, technically another 15 years before that, but that is unpublished stuff that is frankly never going to see the light of day.
Oh, so it's like your very own golden barge.
I think golden is probably not the word for it, but
So obviously, you've listened to the podcast before. You know that whenever there's a new guest or co-host on, we always talk about your history with genre fiction and Moorcock. So where did it all start for you?
So Moorcock was definitely one of the big names I read basically in my teens. I came across the Eternal Champion books, and I kind of read the core books that you'd so I read I loved Hawkmoon. Hawkmoon was probably my favorite of the lot. I read Corum backwards because the library only ever had the second 3 books in, and therefore I read those without any real understanding of what had come before, which is a bit of a weird experience. Ericos, I mean, there were only the 2, I think, at the time, because I remember The Dragon and the Sword coming out, And then I had what must be the fairly traditional what the hell order does Elric come in? With all the different editions and just kind of meeting the same stories in different orders depending on which book you're reading. I kind of, the weirder stuff at the time I kind of bounced off. So I bounced off Jerry Cornelius a bit. And the dance at the end of time is kind of, I find fascinating now, but at the time it was just a bit beyond my sort of tolerance for oddness.
We need to get to them at some point.
It's the weird looking at them now, actually, rather than looking at them as kind of like, yes, this is amazing. Yeah, everyone does these crazy magic and all that sort of thing. It's a really fascinating look at what would a kind of an end stage science fiction utopia be like whenever because they can all do basically anything they want. There are about 9 people left in the world, and they're all incredibly bored.
Yeah.
And it's really, really fascinating. It's almost like the next stage after Ian Banks's Culture sort of thing.
When I first read them, I was really taken with them just because I found characters like Mungrove so amusing. And, because you got like Lord Jagged of Canaria and you've got Mungrove, who's just like it's not entirely accurate to say that he's like a depressive because it's mostly artifice. He's adopted the mannerisms of a depressive as part of because they all adopt these mannerisms and some of them are just fashions. But Mungrove's got this wonderful, miserable, and he reminded me very much of a friend of mine at the time. And I absolutely love. So I loved all that stuff, but I've still got a slight bit of, I don't know, I don't want to trivialize PTSD, but I've got a slight bit of PTSD with the Dance at the End of Time books because I read them in an omnibus and thought it was absolutely fantastic. And my mum said, "What are you reading? Or what have you been reading?" I said, "I read this, Mum. It's fucking brilliant." And I gave her it, forgetting that he shags his mum on the second page, which was something of a fucking disaster. But we will get to, I will overcome my trauma, and we will get to them at some point. But yeah, I mean that whole thing about reading Moorcock in order. I think there's probably lots and lots of people of our generation. You just found Mayflower books on a shelf in a second-hand shop and you read them.
But once you read enough of them, I mean, this is the thing you've mentioned in previous episodes, but you get to that bit. I think with me, it's the second set of Haltman books when they all get together. Because I hadn't read I know it turns up in one of the other books earlier. I can't remember which one it is, but
Vanishing Tower, King of the Swords.
Yeah, and you just. You get that kind of Avengers Assemble sort of bit where they're all together. And that is so mind-blowing when you're about sort of 14, 15 and coming across that for the first time.
Oh, it was fucking amazing, wasn't it? It was, for people these days, the multiverse is kind of done to death, isn't it? But it's hard to understand.
Certainly now at the moment it is. Good God.
It's hard to understate just how mind-blowing that was to a teenage reader at the time because... Moorcock books were like Pokemon. You'd track them down and you would find them in various places. A lot of them were out of print in the late 70s, early 80s, apart from the Grafton Stroke Panther paperbacks. So you were finding Mayflower books in second-hand shops and piecing together this patchwork. I mean, it's amazing, really, to think back that you're collecting these in the late 70s. And there's fucking loads of them. And at that point, Moorcock had only been getting published probably for 18 years, 19 years, and there's absolutely stacks of it. And it's created this whole like microcosm around these characters, or multiverse, whatever, around these characters, and drawn all these connections together, tried to cap it all off in the quest for Tanalorn. And it's funny, I was reading this magazine, Book and Magazine Collector, the other day, and the article in it's written in 1989. And it's talking about how, the Dragon and the Sword has finally underlined the Eternal Champion series for the second time because he thought, Quest for Tanalorn might have been a bit rubbish. I'll try again. So he's underlined it for the second time after he's done all the Van Beck stuff. Little does the writer of that know that it's going to rattle on for, another 2 or 3 decades. So who else were your influences then when you were coming up and beginning to think, right, I'm going to be a writer?
So the biggest one has got to be Diane Wynne-Jones, mostly because, I mean, she's writing for a younger age group than Moorcock, but unlike most of the writers who are sort of writing specifically for that kind of, I don't know, what sort of 12 to 16, sort of what we would call YA these days, she doesn't pull any punches and she doesn't soft pedal with the plot. So there are so many Wyn Jones books where there is just this absolutely crashing reverse about halfway through, where suddenly everything you've seen in the book needs to be reinterpreted in the light of what you now know.
Right.
And you get this in like the Homeward Bounders, and you get it in Power of Three and that sort of book. And that really opened my eyes, because this is showing, basically, this is the thing you can do in a book, which is not necessarily something you're getting as a 13 or 14-year-old reader. The other book that really did this is Terry Pratchett. Before he really got onto the Discworld books, he wrote a few sci-fis. And the book called Strata he wrote, where when you work out what is going on, it's completely mind-blowing. And also beautifully constructed, so it means that all of those things you thought, oh, that's a bit odd, or that, I wonder if that's a mistake. You say, oh no, all of those things are absolutely intentional. And they're clues to show you that all the assumptions you're making about the setting are wrong. So there was it was books like that, I think, that they were expanding my idea of how you can tell stories.
Yeah. What other fantasy and science fiction stuff were you reading as a teenager?
Well, I mean, God, I cut my teeth with Doctor Who novelizations. So I've been delighted that you've been talking so much Doctor Who recently. And that was, but there were so many of them, and a lot of that who had been and gone before I got to see it on the TV. So that was really your only chance to catch up with it at the time. And so I'd go into the library every week and just get in whatever new ones they had.
That was the weird thing about being a Doctor Who fan as a kid, wasn't it? Target books were like an essential source of Doctor Who stories and knowledge, From time to time, you'd get a repeat or a season that'd show a story from each Doctor or something in the 80s. Because I remember seeing the Crotons, I think, sometime in the early 80s. It must have been, maybe it was 1983, maybe it was 20th anniversary or something like that. They showed An Unearthly Child, which I was always really disappointed about because I wanted it to be the Daleks. But they showed An Unearthly Child, which I think is a bit rubbish. Although it is interesting because the Doctor wants to brain someone with a rock.
Yeah, they're still
quite weird when you watch.
They're still fixing what they want him to be as a character.
Yeah, there was Doctor Who and the Crotons, the Troughton one, and I can't remember what the John Pertwee one was. And then there was Revenge of the Cybermen, I think, was the Tom Baker one.
Yeah, was it the Demons or something? Because I remember the same run that they did. And was that leading up to the Five Doctors?
Yeah, it must have been, mustn't it? Because that was the 20th anniversary. Yeah, so that must have been it. Yeah, because I remember always being really disappointed with Revenge of the Cybermen as well, because I loved the Target book. And I was so disappointed with the series.
It is kind of fascinating, especially as the books were... obviously recently I've been listening to your episode on the Blake Seven novelizations, which are obviously not by Terry Nation or anything like that, but a lot of the Doctor Who books, they're by the scriptwriter, so it's Terry Sticks or Malcolm Hulke or whatever. Yeah. And the fact there that they're, I guess they're either expanding it with ideas that they couldn't really brought to the screen, or they're adding in scenes that got cut, but you get quite a lot. The one I always loved was the Silurians, the cave monsters. And I cannot now remember which way around was the TV and which was the book. They had slightly different titles, but you got a whole chunk of stuff from the point of view of the Silurians in the book, which you don't get, I think, in the TV series.
Yeah, I really, do you know what? I got rid of all my Target books when I was about 14. There was, I think I actually traded them in to get the money to buy the first edition Player's Handbook.
Oh, blimey.
For AD&D, because we'd started playing, I'd got pulled into, I was into my fighting fantasy books, but I got pulled into playing AD&D first edition. That was my first role-playing game. And even then, they were quite expensive. When you think early 80s, I'm pretty sure there were something like 15 quid or something like that to get the Player's Handbook. And I took my entire Target book collection, there must have been 30 or 35 of them. And the nerd who ran this shop, All Special Effects, saw a kid in the young teens coming, and he saw me coming a mile off. And I think he gave me like 8 quid for him or something for the whole lot. Maybe not even that, but then I added that to my pocket money. And I managed to get the first edition Player's Handbook for AD&D, yeah. So, I wish I still had them, because also they're perfect one-shit books, aren't they? They are absolutely perfect one-shit books. So when we started chatting about what we could do and what we could talk about on the podcast. You suggested The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. Why?
I suppose they are books I'm very, very fond of. And I was sort of casting around to think, well, what do I know that feels like it's got a sort of an influence on Moorcock and that you haven't touched? Because obviously, you can look at like the 30s pulp stuff like Conan, but you've already done a few episodes on those. But Vance is coming out of that 30s mode. And he adds to it a number of things which are very, very much his original style, because he's a very, very quirky stylist.
Oh, yeah.
And then you can certainly see, I mean, I'm thinking like some of the use of language and the use of dialogue, and also a focus on things like clothes and things like that. I mean, but it's one of the things you brought, contrary to most of the actual depictions of Elric, he dresses like a colorblind fop through most of the early stories. And that's a very, very Vance thing. His characters are extremely... Well, he and his characters are extremely into clothes and materials and colours and all that sort of thing. And you get a lot of very complex descriptions of what characters wear.
I love all that stuff. I can't get enough of it. And I think it's very much a reflection of Moorcock himself, because when you look at some of those interviews, Moorcock there's one in particular interview with Moorcock from the late 60s. And he's very foppish in that. He's got... His hair is quite carefully manicured. His moustache is curled up at the edges, and he's obviously spent a lot of time on it. He's brandishing cigarettes like props, almost. He keeps lighting cigarettes, but barely ever smokes them. And, when you talk to Mike, he's got a very quite unique sounding voice, but his diction in that interview is really, really cultivated.
Like cut glass.
Yeah, and it's really funny to watch, because then you get one from maybe 7 or 8 years later in the 70s, and I think this might have been a BBC Two documentary or something, or whatever it was, but he's sat in a living room with Mike Harrison, with M. John Harrison, and M. John Harrison is sitting there staring into space like he's absolutely mashed. And Moorcock sat in this other armchair with like a turquoise T-shirt. I can't remember what the design on the front is, and he's got his big bushy beard and his flares, and it looks like a living Crumb sketch. It's absolutely incredible, and he's kind of let all that go a little bit, and he's much more relaxed. But yeah, in the 60s it was very foppish himself, I think. But I love all that stuff, and I think when we were talking about this, you said some of these stories are like Jerry O'Connell on his gap year, which I thought, having actually read it now, I thought was a great description, because incredibly, and I don't know why this is the case, because I've had Jack Vance books on the shelf ever since Pops was giving me his cast-off paperbacks. I've even got a couple up here somewhere near my Larry Nivens that I've just never read. And I've never read The Dying Earth. I've never read Lioness. I've never read any Jack Vance. So as soon as you suggested it, I was like, oh, well, yeah, it is about time, really.
I mean, there's the huge amount of his actual science fiction stuff I've not read. But Dying Earth and Lioness I have. Dying Earth I knew before. And also the other reason that The Dying Earth was on my radar is, of course, it's got a Dungeons and Dragons connection, because there's at least a loose idea of where the D&D magic system comes from. Is it very heavily Vancian?
Yeah, and of course, I'd always heard that D&D Vancian magic, because that's thrown around quite a lot in D&D conversations. So it's like, so I already had an idea that we're going to get some of those features as well. What I didn't realise was just how, and we'll talk about some of these things, but just how shot through not only the fantasy zeitgeist, because actually D&D is part of the fantasy zeitgeist now, isn't it? So even more so now, probably, than 20 or 30 years ago when we were playing it as young'uns. But it's a huge part of the zeitgeist. And as soon as you open the door to this like Dying Earth world, and within a couple of pages you've got prismatic spray, and and some other bits and pieces, like, oh, you've got descriptions of, I mean, what is it in D&D? Verbal, somatic, and material, isn't it? You don't actually have those words outlined just like that, but it's plainly evident that there are rules to the magic in the Dying Earth stories, which I think D&D probably went away from a little bit. It's science sorcery as much as anything.
It is. Well, this is. This is a weird and to me being in the trade, it's a fascinating thing about science fiction and fantasy, in that, to start with, when Vance is writing, no, people are not really quite making the distinction, and certainly before him they're not. And if you go back to the 30s, where you've got Howard and Clark Ashton Smith, it's very, very common that you would have, like, a Conan style adventure will go into the bowels of the earth, and they're the Temple of the Snake God, and there's also this huge machine built by an elder civilization, and the idea of a world which has got the fantasy trappings laid over that idea of a fallen high-tech civilization was enormously popular. And I absolutely love that as a setting. It's something I've used a number of times in my own work. And I think probably with the coming of what we now, the kind of the post-Tolkienian epic fantasy boom with Brooks and Eddings and all that lot, it falls out of fashion. You still see it at the beginning of the Shannara books. The Shannara books are set in a far future, post kind of enormous collapse. They meet. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, they meet the machine beast from Hawkmoon in the first Shannara book and have a fight with it. Absolutely, pretty much beat for beat that scene.
The mutant war jaguar of Asia Communista. The
one in the desert that they meet when they go into
the big
city.
Metal steel beast,
and they blind it. But there's
like the Judas Priest
a
album
very
cover.
Similar scene early on in Shannara, because at that point fantasy isn't the big thing, and therefore you needed a bit of sci-fi to sell your book. Moorcock is still doing that with Hawkmoon, but Hawkmoon actually is building on this very well established tradition, which had kind of come and gone by the time that he's writing it. So it feels very fresh with Hawkmoon, because no one else is really doing it at that point.
One of the most remarkable things about reading this, because there are a lot of really direct comparisons between some of the stories in here, because when we get a Moorcock book, generally of the time, those Moorcock books that were really sucking us in and exciting us, you had your three book structure, and there would be blah blah blah, a bit of a setup, and then quest mode and a travelogue, and they would go from place to place and encounter throwaway duck-footed something or other, and then have a fight with them, and something tragic would happen, or a bear in a pair of turquoise knitted trousers, something would happen, they'll come a cropper and they move on. And the first few stories in this don't quite fit that template, but by crikey, but once you're halfway through the second half of this book, that's exactly what this book is. It is, if you were to read this and not know that it was written in 1950, you would say that these are Moorcockian quest stories, which is quite remarkable, really.
I think, one of the things to talk about is use of dialogue, but you see in a lot of the Moorcock encounters, it's not just that a monster appears and attacks them. A monster appears and introduces itself and will kind of set out its manifesto of which parts of them it's going to use to build its castle or whatever. Yeah. And they will generally have quite an almost genteel conversation. And then actually there will be a fight, and the thing will be dealt with. But the idea that everyone kind of stops to talk is a very, very Vance thing.
Yeah. So what is the Dying Earth book, anyways? So it's 6 short stories, effectively, isn't it? That are all connected. One of the things I really enjoyed about it was it's like peeling an onion. It's like the layers of an onion as you go through. You get characters that are introduced in a kind of throwaway manner that you don't expect to see again. And then 2 stories later, you're reading a story which is really their story. So everything is, although these stories are set in the same world, there are also very, very direct ties and connections to them. And it kicks off with this one, Terjan of Mir. And as you pointed out, it establishes a few things quite quickly. The blend of magic and science, the D&D tropes that seem instantly familiar even to someone reading this for the first time. Not the usual Tolkien-esque stuff, but the magical notes, the trappings. Then they've got the moral ambiguity of all the characters. I think there's only one really nice character in this entire book in terms of the core protagonist. Well, maybe 2, because Tsane is nice, isn't she? But she was designed and made to be the nice version of her twin.
Yeah, she's nice to the extent that she's kind of vapid.
Yeah.
That's another thing we probably do need to at least mention.
Oh yeah, yeah. Written in 1950. Sadly, there are a couple of 1950isms in there that probably unavoidable in a way, but at least they're not super overt.
I think to a certain extent because, I mean, weirdly, he's doing something which I guess feels very modern in a fantasy book, which is to say, yes, actually, almost all these characters are at best amoral. So you've got, I mean, I think it's actually Turgeon from the first story who he goes somewhere, he sees a girl he quite likes, he thinks, I will just create a girl who looks a bit like that, and that's just kind of him. And I don't think that is supposed to be sort of admirable or kind of show him in a good light. I think Vance is very much saying, yeah, this is this appalling sort of weirdly hedonistic future where these incredibly powerful people just do this stuff.
Yeah, it is very similar to Dances at the End of Time in some ways, that these characters wield terrific amounts of power. And yeah, Turgeon, I mean, what is he doing? He's creating life in his vats, but seems to be missing a vital ingredient that he can't identify, so they all die horribly. In general, you know, he probes them, he tries to feed them, he has them in his lab. I think one of them is described. How was one of them described? It's he's tried to feed this thing that is made, and it's died. And it says he considered its many precursors: the thing all eyes, the boneless creature with the pulsing surface of its brain exposed, the beautiful female body whose intestines trailed out into the nutrient solution like seeking fibrils, the inverted inside-out creatures. Turgeon sighed bleakly. His methods were at fault. A fundamental element was lacking from his synthesis, a matrix ordering the components of the pattern. Well, that's pretty dark, isn't it?
I mean, I think the element lacking from his synthesis is probably empathy for other creatures.
That's definitely missing, yeah. That's definitely missing. But what it turns out, it's mathematics.
Yes, the elder magic that only this one peculiarly unseeable character can understand.
Yeah, because he reflects back on this conversation he had with an old sage and determines that he must meet with Pandaloom, a wizard who doesn't like to be seen but has the answer, so he uses an ancient spell that he has kicking around in a musty old portfolio. I love that. It doesn't say book, it doesn't say scroll, it says an old portfolio. And he travels to this place, Embelion, which is, I think, Embelion's not Earth. I don't know.
It's a little. I get the impression it's like a little pocket dimension.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be very big. It's literally just Pandaloom's garden.
I was thinking, is this pocket dimension? Is it a strange little moon? I don't suppose it really matters. It's just another place, or it's another plane. And he finds Pandaloom, and Pandaloom gives him a quest. Because so we're going to quest mode. He's got to take an amulet from a priest, but not before he meets one of Pandaloom's creations, a gorgeous babe riding a horse who's really fucking aggressive and gets up in his face. It is unfortunate at that point that after overpowering her, he uses a veiled threat of rape to get the skinny on Pandaloom. That's the first of our little 1950s-isms, I think, which is unfortunate. She's a product of Pandaloon Vats, and Pandaloon explains in the middle of page 8, he says, I too have vats where I mould life into varied forms. This girl Tesseis I created, but I rock. Oh yeah, another common thing with this. How the fuck do you pronounce these names? I don't know. I'm just gonna do my best. This girl Tesseis I created, but I wrought carelessly with a flaw in the synthesis. So she climbed from the vat with a warp in her brain. In this manner, what we hold to be beautiful seems to her loathsome and ugly, and what we find ugly is to her intolerably vile, in a degree that you and I cannot understand. She finds the world a bitter place, people with shapes of direst malevolence. Oh, so, poor lass. But back to the quest. Quick trip to the city of Cain, to deprive a golden prince Candive of his amulet. It's all done and dusted in a couple of pages. But what flavour-packed pages they are. And again, I'm reading Jack Vance for the first time. I'm reading this stuff, and it's interesting. A while back, I did a couple of fantasy novels with Clarkey. We looked at Thongor, we looked at Brack. I always enjoy, and I don't know why, it's just something about me, I always enjoy descriptions of bustling, sweaty cities.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a really, really good one in here. And it says, it was night in white-walled Cain and festival time. Orange lanterns floated in the air, moving as the breeze took them. From the balconies dangled flower chains and cages of blue fireflies. The streets surged with a wine-flushed populace, costumed in a multitude of bizarre modes. Here was a Melantine bargeman, Here a warrior of Valderan's Green Legion. Here another of ancient times wearing one of the old helmets. In a little cleared space, a garlanded courtesan of the Koshik literal danced the dance of the 14 silken movements to the music of flutes. In the shadow of a balcony, a Gael barbarian of East Almery embraced a man, blackened and in leather harness, as a deodand of the forest. We'll hear more about deodands later on. They were gay, these people of waning earth, feverishly merry, for infinite night was close at hand, when the red sun should finally flicker and go black. Oh, I just really like stuff like that. I'm quite a simple soul, you know. Just give me some colour and some sartorial descriptions, and you know, I'm a happy fella.
He's very, very good at just pulling this sort of detail out of the air and just construct. I mean, and this is the way the stories go together. Is he constructs this wider world, and every so often you'll get a callback to the same place.
Yeah.
So which kind of give you this idea. All of these things are going on within a particular geographical region within the same time. So that, you may never visit one of these places, but you'll get like half a dozen references to it in different ways. And it'll build up this sort of slightly ephemeral picture of all of these sort of customs and places and people.
Yeah, I love it. And I always feel like the books I enjoy most are the authors who can do this the best. You know, that's why I'm quite surprised how good John Jakes was with his Brack novels. I suppose you would expect that John Jakes, writer of these massive North and South novels, must have some skill as a writer because he was so popular. Yeah, really good stuff. Right, I'm just going to pause very quickly because I've got a silly beer which I thought would be suitable for this, and it's called Reptile Dysfunction.
Oh dear.
And I thought, because of the nature of this book, I need something a little bit silly. So this is a mango passion fruit habanero fruit IPA.
Holy crap.
That's 6.8%. Yeah.
I am not a beer drinker. I do just want to show. So I've got, this is Gravity Well, the brewery, have produced a beer for the release of Shroud, the book I had out last month.
No way.
Yes.
Oh,
yes. It is sadly is not like a super dark, enormously high gravity beer, which would be appropriate. It's a hazy pale ale, but yes, it's at the. I did a bunch of bookshop event, and they had this at the for the people who turned up.
Oh shit! If I'd have known, I would have tried to track some down.
Do you want me to send you some? I've got a box of it, so I can certainly send you a can if you would like.
You know what? That would be lovely.
Okay,
and I will
address.
I will partake in it for the next show. I might even save it and share it with Loz next time I finally get to...
I'll send you 2 cans if you want.
Oh, that'd be lovely. That'd be lovely. Quite happy to do it as a sharer, but if you send 2, that would be even better. Right, I'm just going to... This is a hazy IPA. I'm a little bit worried about it, but let's give it a go. Actually, not as bad as I expected. Peppery kick, sweet at the front. Actually, that's all right. That doesn't taste... Oh, that's the problem with these. That 6.8%, it does not taste like a 6.8% beer. So that could be dangerous. But I've only got one, so we're all right. I actually bought this a few weeks ago. I had to get a train to Grimsby.
Oh, Lord.
Because Phil was in Grimsby visiting a mother, and one of our cars was out of action. So I said, don't worry, I can just hop on a train. So, I mean, it involved multiple changes. But Doncaster station has got a craft beer cafe stroke micro pub on the station platform, and they have a can bar. So I grabbed a couple of cans when I was in there. So yeah, from Doncaster station, these.
You know what? I don't think I've ever been through Doncaster station without the train screwing up. It just seems to be particularly bad. Every time I've had to change at Doncaster, something has gone wrong.
You know, I'd have been happy for things to go wrong there, because I could have, number one, had a couple more liveners, and number two, I'll have to whisper this in case Phil's listening, it was because we were going to my mother-in-law's. So yeah, I've actually been delayed by a couple of hours and having to sit on the platform in the little pub on Doncaster station wouldn't be such a bad thing. Fortunately, Phil likes to record these, Wimby, but she very rarely listens to them, so I'll probably get away with that one. Anyway, where were we? So I was looking for some information about Vance, and when he passed away in 2013, Christopher Priest, of all people, wrote his obituary for The Guardian, the late Christopher Priest, of course. And he wrote, Jack Vance, who has died aged 96, was a writer of science fiction and high epic fantasy whose work was oddly at variance with the journeyman genre in which it first appeared. His prose, detailed, exotic, resonant of feelings, sounds and fragrances, soared well above the requirements of the genre. He described alien landscapes with bizarre and inventive energy in language that was ambitious, wordy, sometimes lurid, and always bold. So this is Adrian and Andy coming to you from the future, or the future of this part of the podcast at least, but it'll all be part of the complicated web of the past by the time you're listening to this. But anyway, Priest's point about Vance's writing going beyond the requirements of a genre is, the genre is quite an interesting one, because for me, lyricism, beautiful prose, airborne dialogue maybe isn't an absolute requirement of the genre or any genre. It's just a feature of what some writers do and some of the works within that genre, and generally the readers, it's kind of horses for courses, and I'm one of those horses and I know what courses I like, right?
Yeah, and I do think it's a criticism that is levelled disproportionately at genre writing. I think it's part of the general anti-genre, and not just sci-fi and fantasy, but genre in general, backlash that you get from the literate end of the market, really.
Yeah. You know, as a reader, I can pick and choose as I want. You know, so it does feel a little bit to me like Priest downplaying the sophistication of his own readership. But we can get onto a couple more examples of that from his contemporaries, because we had a quick chat after we recorded the bulk of this episode, and we chatted very briefly about a couple of other quotes. One from Moorcock himself in his foreword to Mazirian the Magician, which I do now have and have read the foreword. First point on that: the stories are indeed reordered. So Mazirian the Magician is moved up to the first story and precedes Turan, and that's something we did talk about, which is an odd one, isn't it?
Yeah, given the fact that you have a character who's then presumably being introduced subsequent and given an origin subsequent to our actual meeting them the first time, that seems to be utterly bizarre. I can't imagine why you'd make that call.
Yeah, it's a very strange editorial decision, and it's a shame as well, because it's a really nice little slim hardback. It's a really nice edition, and the rest of the stories in the Dying Earth sequence have all been collected in those editions. Of course, it's inevitably the case, isn't it, that if you've got your fancy Masterworks massive paperback doorstop, which you probably picked up for £7 or £8, that versus getting them all in nice slim folio-sized hardbacks would probably cost you about £50. So, you know, you got to pay for the pleasure, unfortunately. But yeah, that's a strange one. But, and I did send you this, in Mike's foreword, he says, and he's talking about Vance and Poul Anderson at this point, he says, their first imaginative books were works of fantasy published in the 1950s, before Tolkien and Howard had come to define the subgenres of high fantasy and sword and sorcery, and Dungeons and Dragons laid their ultimately corrosive stereotypes and cliches on our unused dining room tables. Ouch.
Yeah.
You were gaming last night as well, weren't you? So
I was.
I feel a bit attacked by this.
Yes, and I mean, we run into this. I mean, there seems to be a point when the genuine enthusiasm and love that readers of fantasy, and that just fans of fantasy and science fiction in general have for the genre, becomes weirdly embarrassing for some authors involved. And I think, you know, I guess people are not that enthusiastic and frothy, and do not kind of identify as strongly with some other types of writing that might have a higher kind of public profile. And so when, you know, if you're going to, I don't know, it's a hard thing to talk about, because obviously a lot of the people who say these sort of, you know, you've got Priest, you've got Moorcock, and you've got M. John Harrison with his the clomping foot of nerdism about world building. And these are giants of the genre.
Yeah. These
are absolute, phenomenally gifted, incredibly skilled writers.
Yeah.
And it feels extremely presumptuous of me to stand up and say, well, actually, I genuinely strongly disagree with what they're saying about the genre. And I mean, Harrison basically has a little bit where that quote comes from, where he's talking about world building being basically the kiss of death for writing. Now, I am a world building writer, and it's a very hard thing for me to go head to head with a giant of the field, but I absolutely disagree. And along with a lot of these other takes on what should or shouldn't go into writing, I think it falls into that category of any kind of prescriptive writing advice is going to be wrong. Anyone who says this is how you write or this is how you don't write is speaking from their own personal process and opinion. And I'm well aware there are many, many gifted writers who do not write as I do, but I write the way that I write. World building taken to an excess is going to get in the way, but so is any other element of writing. There seems to be this idea with a lot of these things that people really enjoy about fantasy and science fiction, that it's somehow kind of squeezing the imagination and squeezing the reader's agency out of things because you're basically producing this very detailed world, which is, I will maintain, what most people go to fantasy and science fiction for. That is what we do. That is the thing that we do that other genres generally can't. So, of course, we revel in it and we take pride in it. And, of course, readers love the idea of visiting this other place, which is presented to them in such a way that they can enjoy being there and they can enjoy revisiting it, and they can become emotionally attached to it. I mean, at the end of the day, all fiction builds worlds anyway, because without it, you just have Dadaism, I guess, where you're just kind of pulling words out of a hat. You need a framework to set a coherent story in. It doesn't mean you have to lay it all out chapter and verse as if you're writing a role-playing game manual.
Yeah.
A role-playing game manual is a different thing because it is being written for a different purpose than to simply tell a story. It's being written to give the games master sufficient grasp of the setting so that the games master and players can tell stories. And this is, I mean, I don't know, with Moorcock talking about Dungeons and Dragons there, has he played? Do we know?
No, I think he's, other than Chaosium having the license and Moorcock saying didn't go particularly well, and I think he felt a little bit exploited eventually by it, and I can't remember exactly how it went down, but they lost the license that he wasn't particularly inclined to give it back to them again. But later on is licensed out again to other companies like Mongoose, for example, and he seems on the surface of it to have quite a good relationship with the French company Le Departement, who were doing the Big Elric board game that was kickstarted a few years ago, and also I think they've just released. Well, I said just, it was about 2 years ago now. They released an English translation of the Kickstarter for their new Mournblade, the new version of Mournblade, which is a game that's been around for a long time. So he seems more than happy to cooperate with and allow these things. Not only that, but one of the friends of the show he did the collector's guide to Elric Collectibles, which is a great little book, and he does a regular newsletter called Pursuit of the Pale Prince. Our pal Jim, he actually is producing an Elric scenario with permission to use Eternal Champion characters, and even recently had lunch with Mike and Linda. So that he seems more than willing to actually cooperate with people when they're doing these things. But I think his overall opinion of role-playing games, I think, is quite limited. His exposure to it is quite limited, so I think it's more of a relationship thing, I think. I think the problem with that, there was, and this is very much, it's a very out-of-date stereotype, really, because of the way that role-playing games have become considerably more mainstream than they used to be, with actual plays and with the films, and like an awful lot of nostalgia stuff that we were doing that was weird when we were doing it as teenagers, but is now much, because we are now people with money who can spend it on things, it's suddenly mainstream. But there was that idea of like the weird insular little nerds in the basement sort of thing, with no social skills. And the thing is, at the end of the day, it is actually a social hobby, but it's also a profoundly imaginative hobby. It's a hobby that has an enormous amount of crossover with actual creative writing. And honestly, an awful lot of the skills, as I may have said, an awful lot of the skills I have as a writer, I learned from role playing because there is that, just that huge amount of crossover and overlap. I can only surmise that his reading of something like Dungeons and Dragons is entirely surface, because you really have to have basically read and digested it to actually pick up on the Jack Vance influences or any of the influences. After all, Moorcock books are quoted in Appendix N and have been since, year dot. But your surface reading of Dungeons and Dragons, when you see it on the surface, is Tolkien tropes and not a lot else. You know, if you don't look beyond the covers and the you know, Mike's never going to sit and watch a Critical Role, you know, presentation of a D&D adventure. I don't think he's just going to see the surface texture of it and not really what lies beneath. So maybe that's all he's seeing. You know, I don't know. It's hard to tell, isn't it? If I ever get him on again, I'll ask him.
Yeah,
I'll say, "What's your beef with D&D?"
It's always I guess what it comes down to is it is always a bit disheartening when you have someone whose work you greatly respect who is kind of dismissing such a large chunk of experience from the outside as being worthless, or I mean corrosive is a very, very rough word to throw at something like that.
He's got form for it though, hasn't he? In the 70s he was being quite reactionary about 2000 AD, you know. In the late 70s he was very critical.
I mean, he has a lot to say about Tolkien in Wizardry and Wild Romance, doesn't
he? He does, yeah, and his epic poo essay. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I don't know. I do wonder if something is to do with their generation, because of course they were fighting to get any kind of recognition in the 60s, and maybe to some degree in the 70s. They might have been hugely successful in selling a lot of books, but it's not like the literary establishment was really recognising them as literary writers until he won the Guardian Fiction Prize, probably for the condition of music. You know, so I can understand to a degree it's maybe a generational thing. 'Cause I don't suppose you really get that kind of attitude amongst modern fantasy and science fiction writers who are being dismissive of 70% of their readership. I don't know. I mean, it's the M. John Harrison quote. I'm not going to read it all out in full, but it says, "World building is dull. World building literalizes the urge to invent. World building gives an unnecessary permission for acts of writing, indeed for acts of reading. World building numbs the reader's ability to fulfill their part of the bargain because it believes that it has to do everything around here if anything is going to get done. Above all, world building is not technically necessary. It is the great clomping foot of nerdism. It is the attempt to exhaustively survey a place that isn't there."
I mean, I guess we basically come down to saying, well, I don't actually accept any of those things. And like I say, he is a way more sort of a writer of considerably more stature than I am. So who am I to say such a thing? But on this hill I die, I guess. I don't think any of that is true. I find that. So here is my counterpoint. Rather than just filling all the available space with the creation of the writer and leaving no room for the reader, I find that the more intricacy of world you build, you're creating like a scaffolding. You are allowing the ascent of the reader. You are creating a bridge so that the reader can travel further out. You're making a richer space for the reader's imagination to inhabit and explore. And at that point, arguably, you're engaging the reader's imagination more than simply saying, right, literally what the book is this set of words here. And you are not allowed to go beyond the specific words I'm setting, because at that point you are caging the reader with this very specific set of inputs. You're not giving them the idea that there is this greater world there that their imagination can reach out into. You're saying it's literally these words and nothing more.
When I read that, to be honest, I did think if you take the approach that he's decrying to the extreme, you can end up with the likes of Danis, #fucking and 5-page descriptions of the absolutely unfathomable sport of Favor and invented units of time and distance that make no logical sense. So I get his beef to a point. But there's loads of people who love that shit.
But also, I think if you take anything to extreme, I mean, I think if if you have a book that is so phenomenally poetically written that you've gone 400 pages of beautiful mellifluous prose before you've got out of the first room. If you have a book where the plot is so incredibly intricate and complicated that you can't make head or tail of it by the end, if you have a book where you are so deeply into the emotional life of one character that you get to the end and think, I have no idea whether anything even happened in that book. So you get this, you have sort of, it's not an uncommon literary thing where you have books that are basically one character's infinite maundering contained in a very banal nutshell. And at the end of it, you think, I don't really know what the point of any of that was. This character had a great, certainly had a lot of thoughts. Anything taken to an extreme, pretty much by definition, is going to be a problem. World building not accepted, but that doesn't mean it's some sort of weird toxic trope that the genre needs to be rid of.
Yeah. One of the most fascinating things about finding that Wayback Machine, because it was the Internet Archive Wayback Machine where I found the blog that he'd been writing from 2007. And after a lot of kickback in the comments and realising that it was being quoted on this in other forums, because, of course, China Mieville commented on it in a podcast, if you go back far enough, talking about some of this stuff, and it was quoted in other things. He did add some qualifying comments to his blog a wee bit later, and it's an interesting read, and there's a couple of bits. There's one where he says, I agree to some extent with Aldous Huxley's description of fantasy as a foreign travel of the imagination. The distinction I would make between the two kinds of world building is, in a sense, Baudrillardian. But although I see fantasy world building as parasitic on its quotidian cousin, I also see it as not much more than a matter of the kidnapping and abuse of some techniques which don't recently have much dignity even in their proper place. Now, at that point, that went so far over my head, I lost the will to explore it much more deeply.
He does sound like he's become a Jack Vance character at that point.
Yeah, it does. I just imagined the bear in the Fez driving a little car around in circles, and I was like, all right, I'll move on. But further down the thread, he does say something that resonates quite deeply, particularly these days, and not only in terms of books, but all forms of popular media, when he says, my feeling is that the reader performs most of the act of writing. A book spends a very short time being written into existence. It spends the rest of its life being read into existence. That's why I find in many current uses of the term active reading such a deeply ironic tautology. Reading was always active. The text itself always demanded the reader's interaction if the fiction was to be brought forth. There was always a game being played between writers and readers, for that matter between oral storytellers and listeners, who knew they were gaming a system and who were delighted to engage each other on those terms. And in a way, that almost sums up modern media literacy and criticism, doesn't it, about all sorts of popular media. He also says world building is a province of people who, like Tolkien, actually resist the idea it's a game and have installed their secondary creation concept as an aggressive defence of that position. It's a strange thing, but I've never really thought about it in those terms, that a book is written and then readers read it into wider existence for years and years and years and years to come. So I'm going to take that, number one, as a validation of our podcast format. But also a validation of the elements that if we do go full circle back to Priest perhaps suggests things that are beyond the requirements of the genre. So going back to that horses for courses thing, I want my SF and fantasy to be what Vance and Moorcock and Anderson and co revel in, and writers like you revel in. They are my requirements, but I totally understand why someone might want to read a page and a half on how a Tarn's harness works and what rope does what and how they're numbered, or pore over a map at the front so they can better visualise just what the fuck a Kimmig is. It's like whatever floats your boat, man, whatever floats your boat. I don't know. But they have their positions and they have their opinions still to this day, and they're fascinating people, and good luck to them, But I'll link to that blog page anyway in the show notes so listeners can digest it in their own time. Thanks for coming back from our own Wayback Machine, or to our own Wayback Machine, and communicating through this dense upper atmosphere of the gas giant, which is why we will sound a little bit different to how we did in the main bulk of this podcast. But thanks for popping back and elaborating on some of this stuff.
I know. Well, it's always a pleasure.
One of the things, just like reflecting back on this, you've got all that, the D&D connected edition, all that stuff. But he probably never read it, and I'm sure he never did, because it was quite obscure. It's quite obscure today. It was probably doubly obscure at the time. But one of the things that it's nothing to do with what's happening. It's nothing to do with the dialogue per se, but there's just something about the way that he writes. There's something about his prose that makes me think back to when I read Blood in the Mist by Hope Mayles. It gives me the same sense of warmth that I'm reading something. I get the sense that he really fucking enjoyed writing this, number one. And when he was writing it, Maybe he was high in his own supply because, I mean, you're a writer. When you write something and you hit on some fucking sparkling dialogue, to what degree do you write it and sit there and nod in a satisfied fashion to yourself and think, you know what? Yeah, that was good. I just get the sense that he was doing this a lot.
Yeah, I know. I mean, certainly that's absolutely a thing I've had. You write up that particularly perfect line or that particularly perfect way of description of something, and he's very obviously a writer who he really enjoys playing with language.
And I think he's only in his mid-30s when he does this, and I don't know how long he was a writer. It's only like 5 years before this. He's still in the Merchant Navy getting torpedoed. To kind of bring all this stuff out, like fully formed, stuff that is now such a massive part of the fantasy zeitgeist, like out of nowhere, in a way that Edgar Rice Burroughs was really important, obviously. Robert E. Howard was really important, obviously. But I don't think anybody, as probably other than Tolkien, for whatever reason, has got quite as shot through that staple fantasy body of stuff that just this one book presents. It's quite remarkable. When you were getting into D&D, did you have a handle on Vance already?
No, and that was certainly where I first ran into the name, and then later on, this is what have I got here? I've got the Fantasy Masterworks edition, which is all 4 of the
that's the one I've got
collections. Well. Yeah, and so when that came out, I was immediately, that's the guy who gave us the D&D magic system, apparently. And so, at that point I said, right, I've got to read those. And you read it and you think, I maybe kind of, in a way, he is. But then you also, for example, not in this book, but in the one of the later books about the Archmages, you've got things like Iron Stones. And that's, if you play D&D, first edition D&D, you remember those as that's the magic item you always want to get, where it kind of orbits your head and gives you all sorts of bonuses. Yeah. And again, that's just lifted, it's straight without even the serial numbers being filed off, lifted straight from Vance. Yeah.
There's one thing that I am really upset that they didn't include in D&D, the expansible egg. Where's my fucking expansible egg, D&D? I was reading that, I was thinking, that's a great idea. Why did they include that? Probably because it's a bit too sciencey.
Is it not basically, though, Leomund's tiny hut?
Oh, you see, this is one of the problems I've got with D&D. I've played my fair share of D&D and I've run my fair share of D&D, but I'm not a cover-to-cover D&D geek or nerd or whatever you want to call it. There were always too many spells in the player's handbook for me, and I didn't have the patience to read it and unpick it all. Something like Prismatic Spray was completely wasted on me, because if it didn't say what it did on the tin, it was like, no, I don't want it. I want Magic Missile, I want Sleep, and I want Fireball, because I was too lazy to read all these spell entries. But that's one of the weird things, isn't it? Because in my mind, part and parcel of the more esoteric elements of Gygax's writing didn't really chime with me. I get it now. Too late, obviously. But it's funny, when I've run 5th edition, Phil and my cousin Emily are really, really into dredging through all the spells and reading them in detail. And we'll be at the table and they'll be playing spellcasters and they will be sat there with their players' handbooks open, dredging through the spells, just reading them all. This is expanding my view of it and what's possible now, because I now know that Prismatic Spray is an offensive weapon. And I had no idea at the time. Now I'm getting the lowdown on the origins of some of it. Yeah,
it's a lot zippier in this than it is in Dungeons and Dragons, I tell you.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. I can't even remember what spell it was, but I was running D&D 5th, and Emily, my cousin, who was fairly new to gaming, she had her player's handbook open and she had this spell. I can't remember what it was, but it was one of those spells. I was dimly aware of the name of it. And she said, I want to cast this. I was like, all right, what does that do? And she told me. I was like, oh, shit. Why didn't I know this? I'd have been using that 35 years ago when I was a player and magic user. Bollocks. Anyway, so Terjan gets his help from Pandaloon via the secret of mathematics.
So when he goes to get the... So one of the other things that Vance does that a lot of the following... and Moorcock does, I think, to a certain extent, and a lot of the other fantasy writers following don't, is there's a lot of humor. And so he goes to steal an amulet or something from Candive the Golden, Prince Candive the Golden, who is also a sort of a sorcerer. And they have a kind of a wizard's duel. And, I will use the excellent prismatic spray. And, I have the magic amulet, which will deflect you. And the best gets, yes, but what if I press this button and just drop you in a pit? And say, oh, no, I have no magic to deal with that at all.
Yeah.
Can I just read that? This just to give people an idea of Vance's use of language. So, what he's saying is, I'm going to press the button and drop you in a pit. What he actually says is, Turjan, you are lost. Before you may utter a syllable, I will open the floor and drop you a great dark distance. During which time Turjan is standing quite patiently on the trapdoor, waiting for him to finish saying. And that's all of them. They're just some weird. There's a sacredness of dialogue, so that when someone is talking, no matter what's going on, you always let them finish their long and convoluted sentences.
Oh yeah, everybody has the good grace to let people finish the sentences, don't they? There's no Conans in this. There's no leap to action. The wizard starts speaking, gets halfway through a sentence, and then there's a blurk as he gets an axe in his neck. It's fantastic. It's all good stuff, and I think because Terjan has this response to Sais to create from Pandaloon's pattern a twin called Tessane, the denouement is actually quite sweet, because despite his moral turpitude when it comes to creating and discarding tortured life forms, he uses his new knowledge to do something that has quite a beautiful outcome, because she finds her twin and says, you know what, everything's not horrible. You should go out on a journey in search of beauty. And later on we'll find that that's exactly what she does, I mean, obviously she comes across some fucking rotters along the way, like everybody does in these books. But yeah, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. So whilst Terjan starts out as a guy who's creating horrific effigies of life that live very, very short, painful existences, he actually uses his ability to do something relatively good, which is quite nice, quite sweet. And the second story, Mazirian the Magician, which weirdly, the latest reprint of The Dying Earth, the one that's got the Moorcock forward, has been retitled Mazirian the Magician, and that's been moved up to the first story in the book for some reason. No idea why.
How can that be the first? It definitively takes place after Turgeon of Myth.
Yeah,
because
no idea why.
It shares some characters.
Yeah, some editor or another thought, I don't know, maybe that was his favourite story, so he wanted it to be the title story, he moved it up first. I've no idea. But if we thought Terjan was something of an ethical quandary, Mazirian takes the biscuit.
Yes, he does make Terjan look quite good.
Yeah. Mazirian's a rival of Terjan's, also creating life in vats, but struggling to perfect it, and he's obsessed with a beautiful rider that he sees in his gardens and pursues always unsuccessfully. I do like the twist at the end of this. And yeah, it makes no sense that this would be the first story in the book, because this relies entirely on the setup from because the rider is Sais. I've ordered this edition because I want to read the Moorcock foreword, so I will report back if it has indeed been moved to the first one. Anyway, so he wants this beautiful horsewoman so he can imprison and experiment on her because he's a rotter. And he's got Terjan imprisoned in a crystal contraption, but Terjan won't give up his secrets. So what follows is a road trip of sorts, encountering various threatening fauna as Mazirian pursues the girl, who unsurprisingly turns out to be Tessane, and she's entrapping him to free Terjan, which she does successfully, but sadly at great cost to herself. And this road trip, holy shit, this is packed with flavour, this Vancian flavour. This area
it's a run through the Wandering Monster tables.
Oh, it's so familiar. It's so entirely distinct. It's not just the rules of magic as an exhaustible commodity that requires careful planning and prep before venturing out of your door, which is established in this, because Tessane chose 2 spells and that's all she can cast. So she's got to go really, really careful, and she's got to be really tactical about how she actually goes about entrapping Mazirian. Knowing D&D, you kind of nod your head and go, yeah, that makes sense. But it's a really, really interesting choice, because before this, I mean, what is magic in fiction? It's sorcerers and weird science and various other things. There are no real rules to any of it. It's a really weird thing to just bring out of the blue.
Yes, because certainly when you see magic in the fantasy that he would have been familiar with, the Howard era fantasy, it's usually the magic is there is a creature, like there is a demon or a god or something like that, and that's the source of the magic, and you basically know how to invoke it to get things out of it.
Yeah.
And it's usually not terribly useful, and it's certainly not the kind of, I'm going to cast a spell and go flash bang and you're dead. It's usually quite heavy prep sort of magic, which obviously would be quite hard to use in a role-playing game, I guess. But when you've got the Vance stuff, it's yes, I will point at you and I will exhaust this spell I've got in my head, and you will explode in a variety of colours. And that's obviously much more game worthy.
It's much more exciting and empowering for a player, isn't it? I don't mind the idea of running or playing a Conan role-playing game where magic is deeply terrifying and horrific. Or even in the Moorcock stories, the role-playing games do insert that let's throw some spells around kind of action. We've discussed many times the Stormbringer role-playing game, right? Demon Boots of Leaping, or Demon Pipe of Smoking, or, whatever, which doesn't really fit that well with the source material. But purely from the perspective of empowering players, and again, this goes back to Phil and Emily, who, when neither of them were natural role players, they were both late starters, but they both fucking loved the idea of having these disposable spells at hand, just one for any occasion, and planning out what they're going to do. Although, because I'm a lazy GM, I don't really play it rules as written. I do allow them a little bit more latitude when it comes to what spells they can cast, because there's nothing fucking worse in a game in D&D than picking your spells and them all being completely useless for what's going on, for the job at hand. I remember that as a kid, thinking, oh, this is shit, I'm never playing a magic user again. But, what a fucking crazy explosion of talent. So in more of his obituary, Priest says, Vance's lasting impact may lie in the influence he had on other writers. Many have spoken of the way in which his imagery freed their own imaginations, while others may be argued as having come under Vance's thrall. These include writers as diverse as Ursula K. Le Guin, Jack L. Chalker, Michael Moorcock, George R. Martin, and Gene Wolfe. The critic John Clue even suggested that J.G. Ballard's penoplanal venues might be traced back to Vance. But Vance himself was an unpretentious craftsman who consistently claimed to have no interest in the art of writing, saying that he wrote only to make money, which, by working as fast and prolifically as he did, he managed to achieve. The wish to present oneself as a humble wordsmith writing fast and commercially was not unusual for a male writer of Vance's generation. It was first published in the commercial fiction magazines that were still appearing in the US after the Second World War, a market where writers were treated badly, payment was poor, readership uncritical, and the work often arbitrarily truncated or padded out for reasons of space. And Vance saw himself as a modest producer of readable text with no aspiration towards literary pretension or status. Well, I've got to... Sorry, Jack. You were pretty fucking great.
You'll have your status and you'll like it.
Yeah, that's right. Again, when you take his omnipresence in the very DNA things of these days, fucking hell, what a guy. We're only 30 pages in. We're scarcely 30 pages in, and already the amount of rich fucking content is incredible. And it continues as well, because in the third story, Tsace, the first page of this section where we see the world from Tsace's perspective, I think is really, really powerful, especially today when, we have more of an understanding of things like neurodivergence and all these other things, and I'm hesitant to apply a modern lens to things written 75 years ago. But, it says, she rode deep in thought, and overhead the sky rippled and cross-rippled like a vast expanse of windy water, in tremendous shadows from horizon to horizon. Light from above, worked and refracted, flooded the land with 1,000 colours, and thus, as Tsace rode, first a green beam flashed on her, then ultramarine, then topaz and ruby red, and the landscape changed in similar tintings and subtlety. Tsace closed her eyes to the shifting lights. They rasped her nerves, confused her vision. The red glared, the green stifled, the blues and purples hinted at mysteries beyond knowledge. It was as if the entire universe had been expressly designed with an eye to jarring her, provoking her to fury. A butterfly with wings patterned like a precious rug flitted by, and Tsace made to strike at it with a rapier. She restrained herself with great effort, for Tsace was of a passionate nature and not given to restraint. She looked down at the flowers below her horse's feet, pale daisies, bluebells, Judas creeper, orange sunbursts. No more would she stamp them to pulp, rend them from their roots. It had been suggested to her that the flaw lay not in the universe but in herself. Swallowing her vast enmity towards the butterfly and the flowers and the changing lights of the sky, she continued across the meadow. That line, it had been suggested to her that the flaw lay not in the universe but in her herself. Oh, Fucking hell, I mean,
Yeah.
who hasn't at some point in their life questioned why they view the world in a certain way that might be unlike other people around us? I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who do. And, not only that, but is it my fault? Is it the world's fault? The world tells me it's my fault. And yeah, it's really touching. It's really effective, that passage, I think, and affecting too.
He's very sympathetic to her as a character, and I think again, that for the time he's writing, that it's quite unusual to have someone in that position, not just being the out and out villain, because often that kind of disability is used as an excuse for villainy. I mean, which is it's a tradition coming up out of like the Gothics and things like that.
Yeah, and here she is because of her encounter with Toussaint, which again is like only probably a paragraph at the end of a story that came before. And this entire passage and this entire story is about her trying to find a way to find things in the world that she can connect with and identify with. It's described as see beauty in, but really it's about relating to the world in a way that's not destructive. And she goes to Pandaloom, her creator, and he acquiesces to her request to send her to Earth to seek out beautiful things. But he warns her of the dangers, particularly those of men, prepares her with spells of protection, enchants a sword, and sends her to Earth. And it's, again, I found it really, really touching because even Pandaloom is dealing with her in a... For the guy who created her in a vat, he deals with her like a daughter.
Yes.
I think it's really beautiful. And she does go to Earth. She comes across a pretty rotten fella straight away. Leanne the Wayfinder is torturing two captives, a man and a wife, to find the whereabouts of the wife's brother, and he tortures the woman to death in front of her husband.
Yep.
Ouch. I had to chuckle a little bit, though, because Toussaint isn't impressed, because she's a changed girl since her moidering days, and she gives Leanne a good stabbing and moves on. But there is a little bit where it's where she thinks something to herself along the lines of, to mistreat a creature to its point of death, even though she doesn't see beauty in things and she hates everything, to mistreat a creature to the point of death isn't really on. Forgetting that one story before, Tarzan has made a woman called Leona who loves flowers. And while Toussaint is riding through the meadow, slashing all the flowers down, she sees Leona, or whatever she's called, and slashes her down as well. Because she's like, oh, I like flowers, dear. Well, I hate flowers and I hate you. And just kills her. Yeah, so, okay. Growth, character growth. Yeah, probably. I suppose we'll better give her the benefit of the doubt. There is some really fantastic examples in here of how Vance as well can be sort of picaresque, but also really, really, very dark. This pops up from time to time. So if the glimmer of flame waned, was lost in the darkness. Toussaint groped her way between the looming trunks, and the murk was magnified by the twist in her brain. There never had been night in Embellion, but only an opalescent dimming. So Toussaint continued down the sighing forest courses, stifled, weird, yet oblivious to the things she might have met. The deodans, the pelgrane, the prowling herbs, brackets, creatures mixed of beast, man and demon, close brackets. The gids who leaped 20 feet across the turf and clasped themselves to their victims. Toussaint went unmolested and presently reached the edge of the forest. The ground rose, the trees thinned, and Toussaint came out on an illimitable dark expanse. This was Modavna Moor, a place of history, a tract which had borne the tread of many feet and absorbed much blood. At one famous slaughtering, Golikan Kurdek the Conqueror had herded here the population of two great cities, Gavazan and Bautiku, constricted them in a circle 3 miles across, gradually pushed them tighter, panicked them towards the centre within his flapping-armed subhuman cavalry, until at last he had achieved a gigantic squirming mound, 1,000 feet high, a pyramid of screaming flesh. It is said that Golikan Kurdek mused 10 minutes at his monument, then turned and rode his bounding mount back to the land of Leidenur, from whence he had come. Oh, what a sod!
But that's another thing Vance does so much in all of the Dying Earth books, is it's the conjuring of just layered ages of past.
Yeah.
Because that has not come up in this story. Beyond that is literally just a mood piece.
Yeah.
And he's constantly throwing these paragraphs in, which just said, it's the dying Earth. Yeah. The sun is dying. Everything is going to end quite soon, and everything that can happen has already happened.
Yeah.
And there is just all of the characters are just surrounded by the ruins of what has been and what's been lost.
Yeah, and everything has that like piled on myth cycle quality to it as well, doesn't it? So this description of this tyrant murdering a city's worth of population by surrounding them in a field with his cavalry and pressing them all together, but then you get that myth-like exaggeration of a mound of screaming flesh 1,000 feet high, which gives it a fantastical quality or element, but it's the kind of thing where truly horrific things take on almost fantastical dimensions through time and through, in this case it might be millennia or more. Yeah, it never loses the core of the horror of it, which is the mass murder of people.
But you can absolutely see, so Hawkmoon's Tragic Millennium, you get a lot of that kind of world building of you find the ruins and you hear the stories of all of these bizarre and grotesque things that have happened.
Yeah. And you get the Grand Britannians creating piles of naked corpses, men, women, and children, just for the fucking sheer hell of it, because it amuses them to create a pyramid of corpses. Yeah, yeah. So her road trip continues at pace. She encounters 3 brigands that want to rape her, but the fallout over who goes first, and while they're bickering, she very, very satisfyingly butchers them all, which I very much enjoyed. That's excellent. Then we learn a little bit more about a deodand who wants to eat her and chases her into the house of a hooded fella. And there's this bloody brilliant exchange between the hooded guy and the deodand. As the man came to stand over to Circe, who lay flung like a doll on the red brick floor, he stooped, lifted the limp form, carried her to a wide padded bench beside the fire. He removed her sandals, her quivering rapier, and a sodden cloak. He brought unguent and applied it to her scratches and bruises. He wrapped her in soft flannel blanketing, pillared her head, and assured that she was comfortable, once more sat himself by the fire. The deodand outside had lingered and had been watching through the iron-barred window. Now it knocked on the door. "Who's there?" called the man in the black hood, twisting about. "I desire the one who has entered. I hunger for her flesh," said the soft voice of the deodand. I didn't do that soft voice, Lee, did I? Oh, never mind. The man in the hood spoke sharply. "Go, before I speak a spell to burn you with fire. Never return." "I go," said the deodand, for he greatly feared magic, and departed into the night. This is great.
I mean, I think the fact that it's the soft voice of the deodand, actually, because it's just like, it's very polite. It's very obeying. I mean, and they make, because Mazarian, I think, encounters a deodand in the previous story, and the idea of they basically look like handsome people. Yeah. And they are absolutely obsessed with eating people.
Yeah.
But they are as intelligent as humans and perfectly able to carry on a conversation, and that's not going to stop them eating you. And that makes them so much more frightening than just ravening beasts. Sort of.
Yeah, it's great. And they're very polite while they do it as well. Oh, it's great. So Circe's adventure, this hooded guy is Itai, who's wronged by a wrong'un called Javan, who took his face, hence the hood. We get a Black Sabbath orgy that ends in slaughter at the hands of green troops with pipes that shoot light beams, and later the 3 of them engage in some verbal chicanery and trickery, then head to an ancient temple, and a 6-armed god sets all things aright. Atar gets his face, Javan gets a comeuppance, and Circe gets to have a nicer outlook on life and a new boyfriend. So that all works out quite nicely. Good for Circe. Then the 4th story is Liane the Wayfarer. The whole book is, again, like peeling the layers of an onion. This one, wicked tale, jam-packed with flavour, wonderful stuff. And there is a twist to the tale, although it's pretty well telegraphed, which is basically if you get tempted into a job but warned to watch out for Chun the Unavoidable. The clue is in the name. Oh, absolutely brilliant. A lot of people have Liane the Wayfarer as their favourite story in this.
I think it is my favourite story. And I mean, you're right. It's not subtle, but it's just, Liane, obviously, we've met him torturing people to death. Yeah. He is someone who has an enormously high opinion of himself. He's got a rare something of invisibility. Yeah. I can't remember. He's repeatedly given clues that Chun the Unavoidable is going to be a bit of a problem.
Not just the name.
Yeah, I mean, and it's just like, it's just his boundless confidence. Oh no, I shall be the one to avoid Chun the Unavoidable.
Yeah. Oh yes, it's amazing. Again, there are so many fun things in there, and just his own ridiculous degree of self-confidence. he could quite easily have been a character in a Moorcock story, or even a companion in a Moorcock story. And I think to some degree, Leanne the Wayfarer, he's like, if he just had an ostentatious cough, he could be he could be like a blueprint for someone like the Verk, just because he's got this ridiculous level of self-confidence. And nothing really bothers him until he realizes that Chun the Unavoidable is genuinely unavoidable. And then we've got Ulan Dor, in which we'll learn more of Kandiv. He's prepping his nephew for a mission to obtain some ancient tablets. And although I hadn't read any Vance, I knew him by reputation, and this story starts to hit the mark on some of the things I expected to come across. Mm. The dialogue has been rich and amusing throughout, but it really explodes into full colour in the first part of this story, particularly when Kandiv is reading this ancient text. But just his little exchange with his nephew. Prince Kandiv the Golden spoke earnestly to his nephew Ulan Dor. It must be understood that the expansion of craft and the new law will be shared between us. Ulan Dor, a slender young man, pale of skin, with the blackest of hair, eyes and eyebrows, smiled ruefully. But it is I who journey the forgotten water, I who must beat down the sea demons with my oar. Kandiv leaned back into his cushions and tapped his nose with a ferrule of carved jade. And it is I who make the venture possible. Further, I am already an accomplished wizard. The increment of law will merely enhance my craft. You, not even a novice, will gain such knowledge as to rank you among the magicians of Ascalon. This is a far cry from your present ineffectual status. Seen in this light, my gain is small. Yours is great. Ulan Dor grimaced. True enough, though I dispute the word ineffectual. I know Fandal's critique of the chill. I am reckoned a master of the sword, ranked among the 8 Delaphasians as a... Pah! Sneered Kandiv. The vapid mannerisms of pale people using up their lives, mincing murder, extravagant debauchery, while Earth passes its last hours, and none of you have ventured a mile from Cain. Oh, fucking great. I love it. I would love to see this performed. This entire first part of this chapter, I'd love to see it performed by a really, really good actor.
I do feel you would need someone absolutely top grade to make Vancian dialogue genuinely work.
Yeah.
The characters using extremely spurious but very loyally arguments of logic to persuade other characters that they need to do something that is plainly a terrible idea is also something that Vance will develop and develop. So in the next 2 books, Kujul's Eyes of the Overland and Kujul's Saga, the main character is basically, he's kind of like a Liane the Wayfarer, but not so villainous. He's just sort of a self-interested wanderer. And basically every story is he meets someone or a group of people and they will all just go through this enormous circular argument of who needs to do the necessary but unpleasant thing, which always ends up being Kujul because he's never as clever as he thinks he is.
Yeah. Did you ever come across the Dying Earth role-playing game by Pelgrane Press?
Yes, I did. I know that there's a Dungeon Crawl Classics version, which is lovely, but does not in any way get this part of it. It's very much, it is a dungeon crawl sort of thing.
Yeah.
You cast spells, you fight things. But the original game, Pelgrane Press did, where you had just rules for having extremely complicated arguments with other player characters, always with other player characters, so that one of the player characters would end up just losing the game of verbal musical chairs and having to do whatever it was that needed to be done.
Yeah, that was the beautiful thing about it. It actually put into the core of the game the mechanics to do what you just described, which is why I never played it.
I think because, you would need...
Oh, you'd need the right kind of players to get away with that,
yes, you would need a group of players who are enormous fans of this particular setting and were willing to put in that basically quite a lot of extra work to have those sort of discussions and arguments. So I'd love to have done it, but yes, I never got it to the table.
Yeah, I mean, not only would I not be able to play it, I probably wouldn't be able to run it. I love the idea of it. I absolutely adore the idea of it. And I wish I and a group of friends had the capability to actually get the best out of something like that. But as it is, I've got it on my shelf and I look at it and I coo over it and I admire it, but there's no way I could ever play it, sadly. Yeah, but I just love that they built that into the mechanics. It's wonderful. Really, really getting and understanding one of the core parts of what makes this so much fun and so enjoyable. But the rest of the story plays out like Moorcock quest mode on steroids, basically. We're really, really ramping it up now. And the last story is the same. So you've got ancient half-ruined city full of weird tech. Check. Denizens live in a weird existence determined by some ancient form of magic or society or tech or all three, with a social order that's initially hard to fathom. Great. A MacGuffin, in this case a pair of MacGuffins, that's directly linked to the strange people and city who our protagonist is after, and a terrible ending for everyone involved, apart from our protagonist and his companion. It's a full-on template and very obviously one of the most direct antecedents to, I think, for a lot of the Moorcocky tropes that get established in the 1960s. It's just there. It's fully formed.
Yes, I mean it's certainly when you get things like Hawkmoon going off to the third book where he goes off to the Amarek.
Yeah.
And that absolutely, you the ruined cities, you have just like weird monsters doing bizarre things. You have, there are temples with special things in them, and then in the final story, you have that sort of demon lord that they have to battle and sort of force back, and that also feels very, very.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, just like any sort of. Random encounter with some sort of powerful chaos lord or from Elric.
I absolutely love the way they actually. I'm going to skip it to the end, but I love the way they defeat that demon thing, that demon face, because they get a close-up look at it and realise that it's woven, and they unravel it with 50 bobbins, 50 large bobbins.
It's Harry Hill's knitted demon.
Absolutely incredible. Absolutely incredible. So different. But, we were chatting, it's like, did Moorcock kind of acknowledge Vance? And we know that The Dying Earth is in Moorcock and Cawthorne's 100 best fantasy books. But also, Moorcock said to The Guardian after Vance's death, he said, "For me, there were two American fantasy writers who stood head and shoulders above the rest. One was Fritz Leiber and the other was Jack Vance. After Jack passed, I somehow hoped he had beaten the Reaper. I hardly knew him, but we had a fair amount in common, including taking pleasure in playing the banjo. His Dying Earth stories were an enormous influence, not only on me, but also on fine writers like M. John Harrison and China Miéville. He was a fine writer with an absolute lack of pretension who could have made his mark on any form he chose. I can only see his reputation growing." So, Moorcock openly acknowledged Vance as a direct influence on his work, and by God, you can see it. And these last two stories, I think, are great. With a few tiny changes, they would drop right into a Coram or Elric tale and feel right at home. But I've got to say, if anything, Vance's prose and dialogue do elevate it slightly. Because whilst I enjoy all those Moorcock stories, I mean, I think they're written with different purposes in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Vance's prose, Mike took this stuff and made it serve his characters. Whereas this is very much, there are standalone vignettes in service of building a world rather than character. So I can understand why perhaps these Jack Vance ones are sort of richer and more colourful. Whereas the Moorcock stuff, I mean, quite apart from the fact he's probably writing it in an afternoon. It's like boom, 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 get our characters to where they need to be, bang, crash, wallop, we're done.
Yes, they're much more much more plot driven. Where characters in Vance, they kind of just wander from place to place, and then eventually something will happen that will kind of bring a denouement. But it's very seldom that they're particularly pushing to go anywhere or have any grand purpose.
Yeah. And I like that rambling quality to it. I don't think I could read a book like this, every book I read, but just for a change, it's intriguing stuff and it's fresh and vibrant. And again, I think Dying Earth, in this, it's about 125, 130 odd pages of it. And you could probably read most of this in one visit to the throne, an extended visit, and thoroughly enjoy it.
I think the audiobook, which is how I re-encountered it in prep for this, is about 6 hours.
I really should slow down on my reading then. Take it in a bit more. Right, just before we get onto this last story, my other beer is Ratatoska Pale Ale from Tartarus Beers. Nothing particularly outrageous, but it has got a nice, bizarre space squirrel on the label.
Ratatoska is the squirrel from Norse myth that runs up and down Yggdrasil.
Ah, well, there you go.
So see if you can taste the squirrel.
I never would have known unless I'd have podcasted with you. So there you go. So this final story, Guyal of Sefer. I've got to say, I love Guyal. I love the exchange with his dad. I love that he's considered a demon or to have a void in his brain, but really is just curious. But he gets on everybody's wick, so his dad points him to the curator of the Museum of Man, and he goes off on a travelogue stroke quest. And it has a happy ending. And I love it.
He's actually got a positive relationship with his dad, which I think is almost unique in this book.
Yeah. I do love that exchange on the first part of it, though, where he's firing questions at his dad, and his dad's answers are absolute magic. We won't read them in the way it's written. I'll read them question and answer. Why do squares have more sides than triangles, Dad? So it was ordained by the Pragmatica. Squares and triangles must obey the rote. How will we see when the sun goes dark, Dad? I have never verified this matter. Only the curator would know. Do flowers grow under the ocean? By no means, since the stars are high above the rain, higher even than the highest clouds, and swim in rarefied air where rain will never breed. Do stars hiss and sizzle when rain comes by night? Oh no, I got these. I fucked these up.
That doesn't sound right.
I fucked it up already. Yeah, I fucked it already. How will we see when the sun goes dark? Will we be forced to grope and feel our way? Yeah, anyway, you get the idea. You get the idea. And he continues to fire these questions at his dad. And there was one is, why do people die when they are killed? Death is the heritage of life. A man's vitality is like air in a bladder. Point to this bubble and away, away, away flees life like the colour of fading dream. Where does beauty vanish when it goes? Beauty is a lustre which love bestows to guile the eye. Therefore it may be said that only when the brain is without love will the eye look and see no beauty. What is beyond the sky? Some say men rose from the earth like grubs in a corpse. Others aver that the first men desired residence and so created earth by sorcery. The question is shrouded in technicality. Only the curator may answer with exactness. Oh, it's just brilliant. I've even got that. I've fucked that up as well, haven't I? How long have men lived on Earth? That was the answer to. What is beyond the sky? An endless waste. It's fucking fantastic. I love it. So yeah, again, we get another travelogue. He goes to find the curator of the Museum of Man, encounters all sorts of weirdness, but also gets to judge a beauty competition. a beauty competition with a twist. It's brilliant. I love it. That might actually be my favourite story of the lot.
And he is genuinely one of the more sort of relatable protagonists of these.
Yeah, it's quite naive though, because when the beauty parade comes out, because they say to him, "Yeah, you got to do three things. You've committed a crime just by turning up and looking funny." So these people say, "Yeah, you turned up, you've looked funny, therefore we're going to imprison you because you've committed a crime, the crime of looking funny." It's not exactly that, but it's pretty much that. And they say, right, you've got three things must you do to be freed. Number one, promise never to do it again. So he promises never to do it again. Number two, judge the beauty competition of all the girls in our village. It's like, oh, Bonza. Yeah, I'll do that. No problem. What's the third thing? We're not going to tell you until after you've judged the beauty competition. And then, silly sod, when all the girls rock up, they've covered themselves in dirt. They're all wearing sacks and rags, and they're all looking sullen and miserable and trying to avoid his eye. And still, he's so fucking naive. He's like, oh, right, okay, let's get down to this. Oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. And it turns out that the girl he judges has to go with him to the Museum of Man, where terrible things will happen to them. But this is where they come across this really kind of fantastic demon face in a wall kind of get up. And the curator helps them defeat it by realising that it's
made of string.
It's made of string. Yeah. Yeah, it's when they see it up close and in detail, it's woven. So yeah, 50 bobbins, unravel it, and then the curator dies and says, "Oh, Now I go to my death, the museum is all yours, all my archives and everything. And Guyal is like, oh, rather than going, oh, brilliant. I've got the knowledge of the dying earth at my fingertips. He says, how do I get in the archives? And the curator tells him, it's like, my key's in my study. And they're like, oh, right, what shall we do now? The end. It's fantastic. It's a fantastic ending to this book. So you've got all sorts of dark stuff in there, but it's a really lovely, optimistic, nice guy gets what he deserves kind of ending to the whole book. And not only that, it gets the beauty queen as well, which, okay, it is 1950, but
I was just going to say, the final or the penultimate paragraph before it's what shall we do? Just like, together we have looked through the eyes of knowledge. We have seen old Thorcingol and the Sherit Empire before it, and Golwan Andra before that, and the 40 Cades even before. We have seen the warlike Greenmen and the knowledgeable Farials and the clams who departed Earth for the stars. And just going on, and just this, his ability to conjure up an enormous world in a very few words. Yeah.
And I just get that sense he would just be sat at a typewriter going, bah, just bashing this stuff out.
I think so. I mean, you can never really tell whether someone has planned something out or not, but I get the distinct impression he's just basically writing it as it goes along and then just doing callbacks to previous stories.
Yeah. And that also makes it incredibly Moorcockian, doesn't it? Bashed out at a ridiculous pace, callbacks to other stuff, whether it be a tenuous link or otherwise. Just great stuff. So much of Moorcock's template is embedded in this one book. It's incredible. Thank you for recommending it because I fucking loved it. And when I get time, because time is always the enemy, I'm definitely going to read Eyes of the Overworld. And I mean, it's a chunky book, so there's plenty more to go at. Yeah, but when I get that other edition with a Moorcock forward, I'll read some of that out in the intro.
Yeah, I'd like to know if they do reorder it or if they've just decided to name it after the second story because they felt that was a better title. The Dying Earth. How can you beat The Dying Earth as a title?
It's a great title. Yeah, so that's the thing. It's not called The Dying Earth. It's called Mazirian the Magician. I saw it a few times on Amazon because I was looking at this fucking massive chunk of a Fantasy Masterworks book, and frankly, I like to read in bed. So another one of the reasons I like skinny one-shit books is they're much easier to read in bed. And this is a big chunk, so I was thinking, maybe I can find an old like 60s or 70s paperback. And there weren't really any at a reasonably cheapish price. Mm-hmm. And then I saw that one with a Moorcock forward, and it was called Mazirian the Magician. It wasn't until I started reading this and I came across that story, I thought, hang on a minute. I went back and looked at it, looked at the synopsis, and realised that it is actually just a retitled edition of The Dying Earth with reordered stories for some reason. Maybe I misread that. Maybe they're not reordered. I'll tell you when I get it. I think it's arriving tomorrow. But final thoughts on The Dying Earth.
I mean, it's one of those books I've reread multiple times now, and I think there are bits that do not age well. I think it's probably worth just giving that as a bit of a content warning ahead of time. But for the sort of the joyous use of language and the effortless creation of this ephemeral wider world, it really is quite an amazing read.
Well, I'm really, really pleased you recommended it because I finally got round to bloody reading it, and I really, really enjoyed it. Much more than I expected to be honest. I enjoyed it so much. It's one of those things where you think, I've had this on the shelf for however many years it is and just never picked it up. That's quite irritating. But at least I've read it now. Thank you, Adrian, for coming along and recommending The Dying Earth. And thank you for dropping in Derry and Toms to talk about it.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on.
Massive thanks to Adrian for taking time out of his busy schedule to drop by Derry and Toms and talk about The Dying Earth. You can find Adrian's books everywhere. His latest, Shroud, is currently available in hardback, and Bee Speaker, the third in the Dogs of War series, is out this summer. I'll grill Adrian a bit on the breadth of his career next time out, but meanwhile, he's also kicked off a podcast with fellow author Emma Newman called Starship Alexandria, in which their future analogues, librarians aboard the Alexandria, recommend books and other media to the rest of the fleet. You can listen to it on the usual podcatchers and find out more about it at starshipalexandria.com and support it on Patreon as Starship Alexandria. We've also had some comms too this past couple of weeks. Jim Jupp commented on our Heartless Layer episode to say, "Fantastic episode, love this film, but can't agree with you on the soundtrack. It's a belter. Then again, I've recorded lots of shit that's more or less the same in the past. Can agree with Miles on bald men as sex symbols, however." Jim, if I gave the impression that I dislike the soundtrack, I have to disavow that to a degree. Derivative, yes. Weird, surprising and strangely incongruous, yes. But ultimately belting, also yes. To the point that, where the funky disco sounds disappear for a good half hour in the second half of the film, it's definitely the worst for it. And on the bald men point, Clarkey also sent me a picture of Telly Savalas, so Miles' Patrick Stewart watershed moment may be a point of contention for some. I suppose we could also talk about Yul Brynner and the distinction between bald and balding, but then we're into a whole other podcast, and ultimately I am no arbiter of what is and isn't sexy. Other than Servalan and Earl Grey Bears, obviously. And Mighty Earrock 7284 said, "First viewing was on a Saturday afternoon at my grandmother's house. I always search the TV guide looking for it again. I now own the DVD. In my top 5, I love Hawk." And Dogherder22 also dropped into the chat to say that the film we were thinking of that came out around the same time as Dark City and prefigured some of the themes in The Matrix wasn't the 11th floor, but the 13th floor. Well, that makes sense. The 11th floor doesn't quite carry the same cachet, does it? Well worth checking out that film, though. We definitely seem to have touched a nerve with our discussion about Heartless Layer. Who knows? We might do more film chats in the near future. Films that spoke to us and warrant a good revisit. We'll see. We had a comment from Glenn Sawyer on Heartless Layer too. Glenn wrote, "Thank you, Andy and Miles, for this episode. It hits so many beats and buttons from my own youth. I saw Hawk for the first time on a VHS cassette from a local video rental shop and, despite all the jankiness, the strange music, the Gatling bow and crossbow, the scenery chewing, all the D&D tropes in one movie, I utterly, unashamedly bloody love Heartless Layer. It always takes me back to the days when our friendship group had not long started playing D&D and anything fantasy was our go-to. It definitely had a huge influence on Robin of Sherwood, which, to my mind, Clannad repetition and awful fight choreography aside, still holds up so very well as great fantasy storytelling and character building. I've done LARP at some of the sites that Hawk was filmed, and they just felt right to be running around doing cross-country pantomime dressed as orcs and knights there, even if it did mean dodging doggers on one occasion. Seeing so many classic British TV actors in bit parts is wonderful, and it's great that many of them are still amongst the growing cast of Breakfast in the Room's regulars, and so they should be. Nigel Terry being a wee bit wooden, Crow being so stilted, Voltan being so OTT, etc. all add to the nostalgia, or member berries as one of my kids call them. They could detract from the film's charm, but actually they kind of add to it all. Gathering the Gang is as much a Magnificent Seven-esque act as it is a D&D trope, but each little scene is just perfect. The interplay between the dwarf and Gort is wonderful, charming, sweet, and has a genuine bit of emotional payoff at the end. Silly string, glowing ping-pong balls, and smoke machines look dodgy even then, but they do once again add to the charm along with the endless rides through the woods and the janky discotheque music. And yes, I want to know more about the lives and stories of the random sets and characters they pass by. As a gamer, seeing that crooked dice minis do figures for the characters is an endless temptation to buy new minis I don't need but want. I haven't read the comics yet, but they are on the to-buy list. The scene shifts, the plot leaps, and so on mean this is a movie that just keeps heading forward. There are no slow bits. I listened to your podcast in the car yesterday, and my eldest sprog, Emily, asked if I had a copy on DVD and she'd quite like to watch it with me. And her younger brother Adam has agreed he's up for it as well. Adam, whilst on a uni visit day to Newcastle last year with me, caught the Prince Valiant movie with Stephen Moyer, and despite it being also, in many ways, frankly awful, loved it. So I have high hopes for what the kids will think of a Heartless Layer watch-along. Thank you so much, Andy and Miles, for the member berries. As an add-on, delighted to hear you'll be doing a podcast about Slade in Flame. As someone who still has a copy of the paperback and a cassette of the album, I wait with a growing smirk what you'll say about that, a much underrated bit of British film, song and bookwork that I still look back on with joy and smiles. Glenn must have been having a catch-up week because he also said on the Film in Elric episode, "Thought this was fascinating. The dedication and hard work that's gone into it so far, really inspiring stuff." Thanks, Glenn. I'm still in awe of what Chris is doing and can't wait to hear more on his progress. And on our Beware the Woodlice show, Glenn commented, listening to this while driving my son home from a university open day visit to Hull this weekend, he thought it sounded brilliantly awful in all the best ways and asked about Killer Critter books, so I may have to buy Adam a copy. Well, thanks Glenn, give our regards to your boy, and I hope you had a good day in the old country. We also had a comment from Ben Haggar on that show. A bit late on the commenting, he said, but I enjoyed this episode and the Woodlice sounds like a hoot. Really surprised to learn that the whole world of Lionel Fanthorpe and Badger books was new to you all. I've been fascinated by him and by them ever since reading various extracts from his work in Gaiman and Newman's Ghastly Beyond Belief when I was a teenager, and reading a Dave Langford column at around the same time talking about his extraordinary stream of consciousness writing style. I've been vaguely collecting Badger pulps ever since, and I found about 20 in the wild over the years, but I've never actually managed to read one all the way through, just because, well, it's pretty difficult to be honest. Although I do enjoy just opening them up to a random page and trying to wrap my brain around a paragraph or two of unique Fanthorpean madness every now and then. Needless to say, I got a massive lol out of learning via this episode that Guy N. Smith was an avid Badger reader and thought they were great, which makes so much sense refiguring out where he was coming from in his own writing. Also, needless to say, Fanthorpe himself always seemed like a splendid bloke, and checking in with his equally prolific, indefatigable career as a mystery solver and Fortean investigator is always a joy, as per this video from a conference in Cardiff, which sees him wrap up both the Mary Celeste and the Croglin Vampire in the space of just a few minutes. And Ben added a link. Thanks for that link, Ben. I'll pop that in the show notes. The penny did drop with us afterwards, after Phil had looked him up, that we did remember him from watching 40 and TV in the 90s, although I usually tended to be in a bit of a state by that time at night. And Graham realised that he did indeed have a Badger book by Lionel under one of his many pseudonyms. Also, we were on the coast a week or two ago, and my mate Stu rocked up with a book that his mate had given him in the pub, so he said, now I'm giving it to you in the pub. And it was a Badger book. There's definitely something in the air when the spheres converge like this. Something to revisit at some point, methinks. But in the meantime, it's just time to thank our patrons. First, those without tier, Anthony Piconti, Tim Gardos, Dave Dempster, and Sebastian Weetabix. And our Chaos Engineers, Ed Von Stout, Andrew Cicluna, Andrew Spong, Andrew Van Ness, Anthony Porter, Benjamin Fletcher, Ben Haggar, Brandon Mays, Dan Charnley, Dave Griffiths, Dave Voxman, Gabriel Laycock, Harvey Faulkner-Aston, Jim Kirkland, Jim Jupp, John W. Lays, Jules Lawrence, Mal Pertwee, Matt Saltz, Michael Hopwood, Nick Hopkinson, Ofer Ziv, Paul McRandall, PJ Cooper, Scott Butler, and Simon Perrins, and our crafty Jugaderos, Adrian Tchaikovsky, Alexander Harris, Brian Henderson, Chris Sharp, Christian Hundal, Graham Holden, Kevin Williams, Liam Turner, Loz, Mark Buckley, Mark Taylor, Matthew Broom, Murray Palmer, Sean Twist, Toby White, and Taylor Lavery. An eternal thanks to our patron demons, Action Edmonds, Alistair Davison, Andrew Clark, Andy Darby, David Lee, Derek Clunan, Fred Quiche, Gareth Wilson, Glenn Sawyer, Greg Faulkner, Gwen Barlow, Ian Stead, Janie Stem, Jason Vogel, Joachim Sund, Joe Monty, Johan Hjarper, Jonathan Sharp, Lee Gary, Marius Latauskas, Mark Hebden, Miles Reed-Labato, Neil Burton, Paul Hillary, Randall Gatlin, Steve Round, Tom Murphy, Tony Malazzo, the OG patron Norman Beresford, and last but never least, Robert McMillan. Okay, enough of my yakking. This has been quite a long one, but don't forget you can follow us on Instagram and Blue Sky with the handle @BreakfastRuins. You can email us at breakfastruins@outlook.com. The webpage is breakfastintheruins.com. We have our Patreon page too, of course, and there are a few extra odds and sods on there. But until next time, take care, stay safe, and we will meet again soon on the Moonbeam Roads.